Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am so thrilled to be talking with CCH and ACP graduate Renee Roskowski. You can find Renee over on YouTube at Thriving Self-Care with Renee. Be sure to head over there after this interview and subscribe to Renee's channel. Renee, thank you so much for doing this and for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
I am so grateful to you. I have to say, like, none of this whole section of the program would even be available without you. You started the most amazing discussion on disability and accessibility in the crystal healing industry in our student Facebook group. And this is something that I've been wanting to kind of touch on in the program for years. I didn't really know how to get started, but because I have learned so much from you in the discussions that are had over on that group, it kind of was the germination point for all these beautiful things to grow and sprout. So I just want to say thank you and just really honor everything that you put into sharing about disability and accessibility in your experience in the student group. So thank you, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being open to exploring this topic. It's a topic that I think needs to be addressed a lot more often, especially in the healing and wellness and crystal healing type communities. And I don't see it very often. So I really appreciate your willingness to explore this and include this as well. I really appreciate it.
It's truly my honor and my pleasure. I think this is something that, like you said, I just want to mirror, really needs to be discussed and addressed because we were talking a little bit before the interview. It seems like in the wellness community, there's usually either the tactic of avoidance of this topic and these discussions, or even worse, the discussions that are had are really harmful. So I'm so grateful to you for coming to share your lived experience a little bit and give a bit of perspective to folks who are watching these interviews.
Definitely, definitely.
So, why don't we go ahead and dive into our questions to get
Great.
started? I was wondering if you could share a bit about yourself and your story with your disability, as well as your experience as a disabled person who's a practicing crystal healer. You do a lot more than just crystals, you do card reading, lots of other things. And also, if you could please share your personal preferred terminology as a person with a disability.
Sure. So I'll start with the terminology first. A lot of people, myself included, prefer identity first language rather than person first language. And so what that means is we prefer terminology along lines of disabled person rather than person with a disability. There's a lot of reasons that go into it, and different people have different preferences for different reasons. And it's definitely something that there's articles and things on the internet that you can explore. But for a lot of us, myself included, using identity first language, actually using person first language, kind of tries to separate us from our disability. And it's kind of rooted in ableism. For a lot of us, our disabilities affect every aspect of our lives. And so you can't really separate that from who we are. And I've found that that kind of also tends to happen a lot in the wellness communities. Don't identify with your issue. Well, I kind of have to. I don't really have a choice. It affects every aspect of my life. Um, it's but it does depend on the individual person. So I would say if you pick one and say it and the person goes, actually, I prefer this, just go with that because it is individually unique. But for most disabled people, they prefer identity first language. Another thing is it can be quite offensive to hear some of like the kind of more cutesy phrases like differently abled and things like that. A lot of people consider stuff like that to be pretty offensive. It's really nothing wrong with using the word disabled or disability. And so I think that's just one of the things to just kind of try and stick with that. And for me, it's identity first, so disabled person. But I'm also not going to freak out if someone uses person first language, but it actually can be considered a microaggression as well, depending on the context of how it's used. So just something to consider. Briefly, I've been dealing with disabling chronic illness for over 20 years now. I got a really, really bad case of mono in the sophomore year of high school. So when I was about 16, and I've never been quite right since. And so it varies in severity, and it is considered an invisible disability. Just by looking at me, you can't tell that I'm sick. But I have quite a few diagnoses of different varying things, but I have an autoimmune condition, I have reproductive health problems, migraines, just a wide variety of issues. I generally would consider my disabilities to be more mobility based physically. It affects my balance, and it typically is pretty energy limiting. But there's also some cognitive issues as well, like brain fog and some difficulties with memory on occasion and stuff like that. I am an ambulatory wheelchair user. So what that means is that I can walk, but I also will use a wheelchair as needed, depending on how my symptoms are that day or what the activity that I'm trying to do is. So in my home, for me personally, I don't use my wheelchair. I'm able to sit whenever I need to or wherever I need to in my home. I'm able to stand long enough to do, small chores and things like that. But if I'm going to be going out for a longer outing or a longer period of time, I will typically use a manual wheelchair or a motorized scooter. Um, and so I do think people do need to be aware that ambulatory wheelchair users are actually a lot more prevalent than people tend to think. Most people tend to think that a wheelchair user is permanently in their chair. And there actually is a substantial portion of wheelchair users that are ambulatory. So they're able to walk to varying degrees and for, varying amounts of time and things like that. And I just think, I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity, because disability it just really isn't talked about a lot in the wellness communities. I've had some experiences in the Reiki community, because that was another avenue that I explored that really kind of showed me just how little some of this is talked about. And so I think it's really important for people to get it on their radars and to be just start becoming aware of some of the issues going on.
My hope with these talks is that everyone who's watching, that this will be at least that initial kind of step to take to gain more awareness of these issues. So, just touching on a couple things that you just answered in this very first question, thank you so much for discussing the difference in preference between identity first language and person first language. So again, if you are watching and you're unfamiliar with that, a quick Google search will really tell you
Yes.
a lot. And also, Renee, you touched on, some of the terms that most disabled people prefer to avoid in
Yes.
language because they're harmful. And so truly a quick Google search of that can also help. And I think this is one of the reasons that so many non-disabled people avoid these conversations, is because they don't know, because they haven't had that lived experience, or they haven't, intimately known someone close to them who's had the lived experience of being disabled. And so they just kind of avoid it altogether because they don't want to do something wrong. So
Right.
instead, they kind of freeze. Um,
Well, and it's not socially acceptable, although you would be surprised how often it happens, but it's not socially acceptable to go up to somebody in a wheelchair and go, "Hey, what's wrong with you? Can you tell me all about your, experience as a wheelchair user?" kind of at random. And so exactly, how do we start the conversation? And how do we do so in a way that's appropriate, socially acceptable, and kind of, generally speaking, non-offensive to disabled people, for sure. I absolutely acknowledge that it can be a little tricky to start the discussion. So I'm really glad that we're able to do this.
Me too. And I'm also really glad you touched on the fact that you are an ambulatory wheelchair user, because I think there's a lot of misconception that every wheelchair user relies solely on their chair, but that, like you said, is very much not the case. And I
Mhm.
think there's almost even a really harmful kind of subset of people out there that think like, oh, well, that person is faking their disability, or they're not truly disabled. There are all these things that kind of come up around that. And just
Mhm.
realizing that not everyone's disability is the same, and that a wheelchair is a mobility device, just like
Right.
any other mobility device. I'm so glad that you kind of touched on this so that people can start to gain an understanding of that as well.
Definitely. And I've definitely had experiences where I've been out in public in my wheelchair and I will say stand up to reach something on a higher shelf at a store or something. And you get a couple of responses. You'll either get the joke of hallelujah, it's a miracle, or which some days I can laugh at and some days it's an eye roll. It's just kind of like, all right, whatever. Or you kind of get the side eye of, well, if you're standing, why are you using a wheelchair? And you try not to assume, but you can just kind of see by their body language and their faces that it's, are you faking? Are what? Trust me, using a mobility device in public is frustrating enough. Generally speaking, most people aren't going to be faking it for very long if they're going to even try to.
Yeah. You also talked about people who are, you acknowledge that there's a difficulty in non-disabled people learning about disability, maybe because they might not know the correct time or place to
Sure.
have those discussions, or an appropriate way to kind of phrase the question if it is the correct time or place. So how would you suggest that a crystal healer, an energy worker, approach a client to inquire about a potential disability or accessibility issue or need for accommodation?
So I think one of the biggest things that I've already mentioned to consider is that not all disabilities are visible. So a lot of times you are just not going to know if your client has a disability. There can be heart conditions, autoimmune conditions, so many different conditions that are just completely invisible. So I think one of the simplest ways to start is to have a simple statement on your website or your promotional materials and just say something along the lines of, please let us know if you need any assistance or accommodations due to an injury and or disability. Because injuries can also be disabling, but temporarily. And so kind of phrasing it that way may just there's a lot of there can be a lot of internalized ableism, especially when you first become disabled. And so phrasing it that way is very simple, open, and it allows people to kind of address the issue in the way that they feel comfortable with, but also shows that as a practitioner, you have some awareness of the fact that people may need accommodations and that you're willing to have the dialogue, because sometimes it can be uncomfortable to say, yeah, you know what? I can't do it that way, or can we do this differently, or this isn't working for me, or functional for me, or feasible for me. And so I think just something really simple like that starts the dialogue without making assumptions and without putting a lot of undue pressure or kind of funky language or anything like that. And then you can also just make it part of your client intake even every time, because you never know, something can happen between when a person has an appointment and when their follow-up appointment is, or when their next appointment is. So even just asking, do you need any accommodations for an injury or disability today? Yes, no. And then if it's a yes, you can start a discussion, and if it's a no, move on by and you can just keep going. But it also takes a little bit of the burden away from the disabled person having to bring it up and be like, hey, there can be some um guilt, for lack of a better word, for kind of needing to be special or different or extra, or because it goes along with ableism and the fact that it's not often considered. And so a lot of times we might feel uncomfortable bringing something up because of that, especially if you're towards the beginning of your journey with dealing with disability. And so just asking that simple question can open the door to the discussion, and then you can kind of go from there. And it doesn't have to be anything overly complicated, or just a simple phrase or a question. I will say, when you start to have this dialogue, if someone says, yes, actually, I do need some assistance or some accommodations, it is generally considered rude to ask for specifics like an actual diagnosis from someone you don't know very well. Now, obviously, because we're doing crystal healing, some of that may be relevant for what we're doing in the crystal healing session, but it's so in this situation, it can be a little bit of a fine balance. But the 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 best thing to do is to consider keeping the conversation more limited to maybe the symptom or the difficulty that needs to be addressed or accommodated versus kind of trying to get more in depth with what the person's diagnosis is and stuff like that. And I'm going to say it, and I'm assuming most people here probably don't need to hear this, but I am going to say it because you would be stunned how many times we hear this question asked of us from complete strangers in public. Please don't ask us what's wrong with you. We get it all the time. It's rude, it's invasive, it's inconsiderate, and it's a way to start the conversation in a completely off on the wrong foot, rather than helping the person to feel comfortable sharing what they might need, or what might help them, get what they need for the assistance with the session. The big thing too is be open. Sometimes, and a lot of times, your client might know what they need to accommodate their disability. They might not, though. And so they may say, yeah, I need a step stool to get up on your table, or I need extra bolsters because of a pain issue. Or they might not know, or they may have something that comes up in the middle of a session, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, what can we do? Just be open, talk, offer options, and then respect what the client has to say as well, I think is the biggest thing.
Okay, I have to tell you, I love every single thing you've just said here because first and foremost, to address the question, you have two solutions. One is front facing right off the bat on your website, marketing materials, whatever. And second is that face-to-face, more just discussion-based type of question that asks, do you need any accommodation today because of an injury or disability? It's really simple. It's really respectful. It's really easy.
Absolutely.
And it invites further dialogue from the client based on what their needs might be. And I really like how, even though it is a yes or no question, right? If they say yes, it does invite that person to share and say, yeah, actually, I would need this. I'm also really glad that you brought up that it's not always the disabled person's responsibility to know exactly what they need. So yes, they might tell you, I need a step stool to get up on the table, or they might just say, I need help getting up on the table, or I'm not sure I
Right.
can get on the table.
Right.
And then you can say, well,
Exactly.
would a step stool be helpful, or would you prefer to do it in a chair? Like, then it's kind of on you to offer those options. And,
Exactly.
as long as you're being genuinely kind of helpful and offering some solutions, I mean, is that what most disabled people would be looking for? Like, oh,
Yes.
okay, these are the options, and we'll go from here.
Yes. I think just genuinely caring and just trying to help the person is more often than not what's acceptable. We obviously everyone's personalities are different, and you're going to have difficult people, and you're going to catch people on a bad pain day or a bad brain day where they might be snappy, or but I think genuinely, if you're just like, well, here's a couple things, would those work? The other thing is you might offer some things and those things might not work, but it might help the client to go, actually, instead, can we do this or that? Even though it wasn't one of those specific options, especially with people who are new to participating like in something like a crystal healing session, they may not just understand the mechanics of it and what's going on and what might be necessary. And so it just might take a little bit of conversation back and forth. And I do think that just having genuine compassion and just trying to be open and trying to offer some solutions, I think is just really the starting block, and what most people are going to appreciate.
Yeah, and just kind of getting the opportunity to be creative when coming up with those solutions together is great.
Definitely.
And like you said, there's a certain way to have that conversation that sets the tone for the rest of the session.
Right.
So making sure that you are, keeping your conversation respectful and the questions that you have respectful. Saying, well, would it be painful for you to be in this position or to step up this way? Like that's okay and not super invasive.
Right.
So yeah, there are ways
Exactly.
to have those conversations.
And it's applicable to the process of doing the session. So just kind of keep that in mind too. Like, is this extraneous information that maybe, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful here, but maybe you're just, it's almost kind of feeling a little nosy or a little intrusive, or is this something that's applicable to the session? Are you going to be comfortable in this position for this amount of time? If not, what can we do to help that, whether it's bolsters or pillows or a chair instead of the massage table, or a couch or a mat on the floor, or that type of stuff is what you're going to be looking for. Like, is this actually applicable to the session versus is it maybe getting a little personal or a little invasive? And again, there can sometimes be a fine line because of what's necessary for doing a crystal healing session, but I think just kind of keeping that in mind can really make a difference.
Yeah, asking yourself, do I need to know this
Yes.
information going
Yes.
forward? And also, maybe if you have a question that you're uncertain of, you think you might need to know, would you feel comfortable telling me more about this? And if not, we can work around that. And then you're giving that person agency to say, I don't really know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that comes back to respect what the person says. If they say no, it's a no. No means no. Or if they say I'm not comfortable talking about that, or it's also reading the room a little bit. If the person kind of gets a little quieter, withdrawn, okay, maybe this is not the right line of conversation for us to be going for at this point, or maybe the right way of doing it. But for the most part, I think if it's applicable to the session and you're just truly kind of trying to help and find a solution, that's going to most likely be generally acceptable to the client.
Now, you touched a little bit also in that question on invisible disability. And so, asking these questions at the beginning of a session, having these questions posted on your website really kind of helps cover your bases that way. Because, and I don't want to like speak for you, but my assumption is the point you're trying to drive home is you can't always spot a disability. So, you can't
Right.
just ask these questions of people who you believe to be disabled,
Right.
because this could be for anyone.
Right. And by asking it of everybody, it takes away a little bit of some of the kind of bias or the assumption that just because somebody looks a certain way doesn't mean that they can't have a disability, or they're also, or just because someone is obviously disabled, maybe they don't need any kind of accommodation, maybe they've got a handle on it and it's just fine. And so by asking it of everybody, it kind of puts it on it, just kind of makes it kind of equal for everybody. And it also makes sure that if someone is new to being disabled, they might not even think of it. Oh, I can adjust things, I can have things, changed, or you're willing to help me. Like, it takes the burden away from everybody by just having it there and asking everybody every time. It just makes sure everybody every time gets that chance to say yes or no.
I love that. Just setting it as a standard of practice kind of across the board. And also, even if someone, isn't new to being disabled, but maybe they're new to crystal healing sessions, they're new to energy work, they don't really know what to expect, or they're
Absolutely.
not certain how to, create accommodation for that experience. That's kind of like your job as a
Right.
healer, as an energy worker, to create that comfortable, supportive space for your client.
Exactly. Exactly.
Let me ask you this, kind of switching gears
Sure.
from the client perspective to disabled crystal workers. What types of accommodations have helped you as a disabled crystal healer?
So I think the biggest one is like time and flexibility. So the starting point of that for me was with learning. It's actually part of the reason why I signed up for CCH and ACP as opposed to some of the other crystal healing certification programs. Was there's no time limit for CCH and ACP. And for me, that was huge because my symptoms can vary from day to day, sometimes even hour to hour. And so I may be able to work on an online learning program consistently, or I might have flare-ups and I might not be able to work on it for periods of time, which is exactly what happened. And so for me, having that flexibility and that timing really made a huge difference for being able to learn at all. Because had I had to stick with something that had a set deadline, and there was another program that I considered, and it had set deadlines, and I was like, I don't know, I don't think that's going to work for me. And what ended up happening is the time frame that I would have signed up for it, I crashed and had a huge flare up of my chronic illness, and I basically would have lost out on that entire experience and the financial investment to it. And so time and flexibility for me are a huge, huge thing that makes such a big difference because of the variability of my symptoms. Another big thing is distance sessions. So as a client, I think distance sessions are really important because of that as well. But as a practitioner, what that allows me to do is schedule things and be able to complete them in my own home where it's comfortable. I can wear my PJs. um, if I don't feel, we're talking realities here. If I don't feel up to taking a shower and that happens, I'm not going to make anybody else uncomfortable with my hygiene or, things like that. And, a big one is scents. Scented products cause me migraines and all kinds of things. And so I'm not having to worry about that from clients. I don't have to travel to and from where I'm doing sessions. All these things that add up. Another thing that some don't consider or um, might not think about is I can have bad brain days where I know the information, it's not coming. It's just not going to come. And so by being able to do distance sessions, I can look up stuff in reference materials and not feel self-conscious about, this client is paying me, and it doesn't detract from the healing that they're receiving. But maybe a little bit, or maybe the client might feel a little uncomfortable with their practitioner going, yeah, what, I'm sorry, I got to look it up in this book. It's like, well, what am I paying you for? But then once that little bit of a reminder is there, it can help, like, oh, okay, and then my brain can kind of get rolling. And so those are a few things that um as a disabled practitioner help me to be able to give my client the best experience while also supporting myself in dealing with my symptoms as they vary from day to day, and minimize like allergic reactions and things like that. So those were kind of like the two biggies, but I think the biggest one is for me is time and flexibility, flexible scheduling, flexible learning, and the time to work through those things while accommodating the changes in symptoms and bad days versus good days and things like that.
This is such good insight. I mean, definitely something that is a common theme throughout all three interviews has been the timing and flexibility. I think just knowing that if you're having a bad day or a pain day, you can do something a little later in the afternoon or,
Mhm.
whatever you need to do, or on a different day entirely.
Right.
That is like just a huge um, comfort and support in addition to an accommodation. That's
Definitely.
But I'm so glad, Renee, that you brought up the retrieval of information. Like having to look something up in your notes in a book does not make you any less of a crystal healer, does not make you like a bad practitioner, anything like that. But because there's this societal expectation
Yes.
that is, expects experts, right?
Right.
Professionals to have all the knowledge and be able to retrieve all the knowledge at the drop of a
Right.
hat. It would. I mean, I would definitely be self-conscious having to look something up in front of a client because I would be afraid of what their thought
Right.
was.
Exactly.
And that's something I would never have thought of until you just brought that up. That's such a good point. Whereas when you're doing the distance session, you can slow down, you can take your time, you can look things up. You can have all of your tools available that you need to refer to and reference. So I'm just really thankful that you brought that up.
Definitely. I just wanted to throw in too, with that, I'm actually creating for myself a, a kind of a nice looking, I'm calling it my healer's notebook of reference materials for myself that are combined and all in one place so that when I go to do a session, I can kind of thumb through things as needed and it's kind of all put together. And not that that makes a difference if a crystal healer doesn't have something like that, that's okay too. But for myself, I wanted kind of like a nice put together reference of stuff that I thought that I would probably, that I might need on a bad brain day. Where I can just have it and it's kind of all together rather than having to stop and take the time and go and find where I put this thing and that thing or this information or that information. And that's an accommodation for me for a time when my brain might not be at its best. And like you said, it doesn't mean that I'm not a good or an effective crystal healer. It's an accommodation for the cognitive difficulties that can be associated with chronic illness and disability.
Yeah, I was actually just talking with someone a few weeks ago who had a brain injury in the past from an accident at her workplace. And she was telling me about the way that she prefers to take notes, which is on her iPad. She likes to type everything out because they're more searchable. Yeah, it's a quick digital search for a keyword that will then refresh her memory on what she was looking for rather than having to flip back through lots of
Yep.
pages of notebooks, which truly is like that's helpful for anyone. But in
Sure.
particular, yeah,
Absolutely.
if you're dealing with a brain injury, cognitive disability, I think that's really valuable. So switching gears again, going back to
Sure.
looking at clients then, what are some of the accommodations that a crystal healer may want to have available for disabled clients? And this is probably largely going to be physical accommodations, but anything that comes to mind that,
Sure.
average person could have on hand to support their client.
Sure. So the very first one that I thought of was honestly scent-free spaces. I know a lot of crystal healers love their aromatherapy and essential oils and smoke cleansing and incenses, but honestly, they can be such a huge trigger for allergies and asthma and migraines. I've personally had to leave spaces because of the scented products that were being used, and even essential oils can trigger these issues, though, some practitioners don't believe that. The other thing along with scented things is your laundry and personal care products. Um, I I have had experiences with people's laundry products causing me migraines and allergic reactions. And so, yeah, it's something that a lot of people don't often realize how disabling it actually can be because you have to leave grocery shopping because the area is so heavily scented from cleaning products and laundry products and then the personal products that people are using. And so if you can consider having a scent free space, that's going to make your space alone a lot more accessible. Lighting, the lighting that you have can also be an issue. Some people have problems with fluorescent lights. And obviously, if you're renting a space, you may not have a lot of choice in the ambient lighting, but you can use lamps that are a little bit dimmer. You can have lamps on dimmers, things to make the space honestly dimmer. That's usually the biggest issue. If I'm having a migraine or I'm post migraine, I'm gonna be really light sensitive. And so having the ability to have the space dimmer through lighting, I'm looking at my curtains right now, through curtains that can block out some of the sunlight can really make a difference in somebody's physical comfort. For me, with mobility issues, look at your space. Could somebody in a wheelchair easily and safely navigate your space? Unfortunately, a lot of times it's no, because things are set very narrow together and not aisles aren't very wide. Can a wheelchair get through your doorway into your space? Are there stairs? Even one stair no matter how big or small, basically means that your space at that point is not accessible to somebody using a wheelchair or a mobility scooter. Now there's, you can get portable ramps and things like that that are safely and appropriately made to overcome those. So that's something that you can look into. But even just the setup of your space, the placement of tables and furniture can mean the difference between someone able to safely navigate your space. Think about crutches and walkers. Are there big corners that people can catch their mobility devices on, things like that? My husband actually made the suggestion. You know what? I'm going to say it. He said, take a wheeling desk chair or any chair, put it in places throughout your space, sit in it and look. Can you move through this space on a wheeling desk chair? If you can't, people in a wheelchair are not going to be able to navigate that space. So that's something that really can make a really big difference in the accessibility of your space. And I know that when it comes to rented spaces, there may be things where you don't have a ton of choice in how you can set the space up, but it's something to think about because a lot of people aren't even thinking about that. Think about it, explore it a little. Can you move a piece of furniture? Can you cut back or maybe wall mount some of your displays and just change things up a little bit to make things more easily accessible for those with and safely, not just easily, but safely accessible for those using mobility devices. For things like vision impairments, is your website enabled and optimized for accessibility for things like screen readers? Do you have large print materials available? Or, in this day and age, we all have tablets and things like that. Do you have your materials on a tablet where the font, it can be enlarged? So a person with a vision impairment could look at your materials in a larger font or a larger print. Things like that can really make a really big difference in working with vision impairments. Consider communication needs for people that are deaf and with hearing impairments. Can they see your mouth? A lot of people lip read, not everybody. So don't make an assumption about how that person might need to communicate. Again, this goes into that, how can I accommodate you? Texting and messaging rather than phone calls might be more feasible for someone that's deaf or hard of hearing. Having writing materials available so you can write notes back and forth to each other. So very, very simple things. And I'm not, because of my own experiences, I'm not able to get into the depth of the nuance of dealing with being deaf and hard of hearing and vision impairments. But those are just some simple things that you could just start with to help make sure that people with those impairments are able to at least communicate with you. Two other things that I'm just beginning to explore are neurodiversity and becoming trauma informed. With Crystal Healing, we are working with the body. We are being close to people. We are touching people through putting crystals on their bodies and things like that. And so I think it's really important to consider trauma and how that can affect people's experiences of having a crystal healing session and during a crystal healing session, but also making sure that we're kind of aware of that throughout the healing session as well. So something as simple, and again, I'm just starting my journey with exploring neurodiversity and becoming trauma informed as a practitioner. But one of the things that popped into my head is perhaps someone who experienced an assault doesn't want to be touched. So instead of placing crystals on them, you can place the crystals around them within their aura, within their energy field, so that you're not having to touch them or come close to touching them, but they're still able to experience the benefits of a crystal healing session. And that's just one, very brief example of a way that you can help someone feel more comfortable. You can talk beforehand and agree on a non-physically touching signal to end the session. Things like that, where it may not seem like that big of a deal to another person, but someone coming up and touching a person who was assaulted while their eyes are closed may be extremely triggering, which defeats the whole purpose of the relaxation involved in the session. So things like that, I think, are really important for us to at least try to become aware of when it comes to working with our clients in a session. Another one is scheduling methods. How accessible is it for people to schedule with you. If you use an online scheduler, is it enabled for screen readers and things like that? And your availability. Again, some of this, I don't want to say this like in the wrong way, but we aren't all necessarily going to be able to accommodate every single thing that every single person needs all the time. But having something like varying times of availability, like mornings and afternoons and evenings, not necessarily like every day, but that allows people who maybe their symptoms are the worst in the morning. So an afternoon or an evening session is best for them, or maybe they do their best in the morning. And so having morning sessions is really important for them. And so by having some variability in your schedule for when you're available for a session allows people to kind of be able to come when they're most likely to be feeling their best as opposed to their worst. Another thing is with scheduling is flexibility with cancellations and rescheduling within reason. Obviously, there are people who are going to take advantage of that kind of thing, but I can schedule an appointment for a week from now and I can wake up that morning with a migraine. I wouldn't have warning of that. And it's not anything that I'm trying to be intentionally rude or disruptive, but some days I don't know how I'm going to feel in an hour, let alone later or the next day or a week from now. And so within reason, I obviously healers, practitioners deserve to be compensated for their time appropriately. And I know a lot of practitioners have cancellation fees and things like that. And I think that's totally reasonable. But I think we have to consider some flexibility for rescheduling to be an accommodation for somebody who's dealing with chronic illness or disability. Another thing that I thought of that I hadn't thought of before now is the possibility of switching to a distance healing session instead of an in-person session for that time. It allows the client to retain the benefits of the session and the practitioner to not have a last minute cancellation with the loss of income. But it actually popped into my head because of my therapist, my mental health practitioner. It was one of the questions I asked her. I'm like, hey, you know what? I don't know how I'm going to feel every time we have an appointment. If I have an in-person appointment scheduled and I wake up, feeling awful or I have a migraine, can we switch to a Zoom session for that same time frame instead of a cancellation? And she said yes. And I'm like, wow, that's a pretty simple thing to do. You're still utilizing that same time frame as a practitioner, and then you're hopefully not losing that income from that session. That would be a cancellation as opposed to switching to a distance session. Another thing that I think a lot of people don't think about, and again, this is very personal and very individualized, is to consider having services at a variety of price points or having limited sliding scale options or payment plans. Most disabled people are on very limited incomes. And so having maybe something like a simpler service where it's a lower price point and then like a more comprehensive service or a shorter session versus a longer session at different price points can go a really long way to helping accommodate budgetary needs. Same thing with limited sliding scale. That's something you can look up on the internet. There's a lot of examples of stuff about limited sliding scales and how you can structure that in a way that you might feel comfortable with, but also doesn't necessarily kind of take away from the income potential of those time slots and things like that. That's definitely something that can be really workable, but something to consider. And again, everyone has their own preferences and opinions on pricing and things like that, but it is something to consider that most disabled people are on very limited incomes. And then just the physical realities of doing a session and considering how you perform a session. So a lot of crystal healing practitioners utilize a massage table. Can the person get on the massage table? Do they need a step stool? Is that safe? And I'm going to point out liability here for when you're helping someone with a mobility impairment on and off of a table and they fall. It is something to consider in terms of liability and safety and the health of your client as well, because we don't want our clients to fall and get injured either. and we don't want to be injured assisting our clients. And so the physical mechanics of doing a session, it might be more feasible to work with a chair or a zero gravity chair or a couch or a camping cot or on the floor. Again, considering our own body mechanics as a practitioner as well, we don't want to injure ourselves in doing these things, but just that's something to consider in terms of like the mobility impairments and things like that. Do they need additional cushioning or bolsters for pain? Shorter sessions, honestly, like for myself personally, I cannot tolerate 60 minutes laying still on a massage table. It's just too physically uncomfortable for me. And so by offering maybe a couple different time frames of sessions that are available can really help accommodate different needs. Maybe the person will need to shift positions, or maybe they just have difficulty laying still for a time for a variety of reasons. So another thing that you could consider, as I mentioned before, is instead of placing the crystals on the body, perhaps you place the crystals around the body in the aura, in the energetic field. That allows people to move and shift, and if they have to even turn on their side or raise legs or any kind of body positioning that they might need to do for their comfort, you're not dropping crystals off and they're not rolling off and falling on the floor, potentially breaking, a thing getting lost, things like that. And so that can make a really big difference um, in being able to complete a session. And again, distance sessions, offering clients distance sessions can be kind of an ultimate accommodation. I'm able to be in the comfort of my own home in a comfortable position, whether it's my bed or my couch or a chair. There's no sense here. I don't have to worry about traveling to and from the session, which is mental and physical exertion. The physical exertion, whether people kind of realize that or not, of being in a session, because it is physical exertion. And that all of that can take a lot. So offering distance sessions can actually be a pretty substantial accommodation. And then something I'd like to touch on briefly is service animals in a session. I'm going to talk about things in the United States because different laws vary from country to country. So what I'm going to be saying is going to be in reference to the United States. But service animal is a dog, or in some cases a miniature horse, that is task trained, tasked to provide work or tasks that mitigate the handler's disability. Emotional support by the mere presence of the animal does not constitute a service animal. And so in the United States, there's laws that apply to service dogs and access to public places of public accommodation. And so I think it's really important for practitioners who are working in spaces to be aware of what their obligations are in terms of accommodating a service dog. And you can look that up online. There's a lot of references. You want to make sure you go to the Department of Justice, Americans with Disabilities Act reference material specifically, because there's a lot of scam organizations and misinformation out there. So you want to look at the basically DOJ.gov websites. And there's also state laws in many states that require the accommodation of service animals as well. And so just kind of briefly, in the United States, when it comes to service animals, there's two legally allowed questions that you can ask when it's not readily apparent that an animal is a service animal. And that is this animal required because of a disability? And what tasks or work is this animal trained to perform to mitigate your disability? You cannot ask them what their diagnosis is or what their issue is, and you cannot ask them to perform the task or work. That's illegal. And asking questions outside of those two legally allowed questions is also illegal and can get you in trouble through monetary fines and sometimes even criminal penalties, depending on the state law as well. I always like to mention that in the ADA law regarding service animals, there are businesses are legally allowed to ask for the removal of a service animal in several specific situations. If the animal is out of control, If the animal poses a direct threat to health or safety, and that's generally interpreted as behaving aggressively or being excessively dirty, like, grimy and grungy and smelly and that kind of thing. And if the animal is not house trained. So if the animal has an accident, you can ask for them to be removed. If the animal is out of control and the handler is not taking adequate methods to regain control of the service animal, you can ask for them to leave. The animal is aggressive, barking, growling, lunging, snapping. You can legally ask for them to leave. Another big thing is you cannot ask for or require any form of certification, registration, or identification for a service animal in the United States. There are none. There are no governmentally required or recognized certification, registration, or identification of service animals. Anyone who is showing those got scammed. There's a lot of scam certifications out there. Asking for or requiring those things for entry is against the law. And again, you can get monetary penalties and sometimes even criminal penalties for interfering with a service animal. There's a lot more information available online. And as a business owner, I recommend that people educate themselves about it, because it can be pretty simple to tell the difference between a properly trained service animal who's behaving appropriately and either a service animal who is task or work trained but isn't behaving properly, or a fake animal, someone who is just trying to pass their animal off. And that could be a whole class unto itself. But I always like to make sure that people know that it's really important to accommodate service animals, and allergies or fear of a service animal are not legally valid reasons for denying a client bringing in their service animal. And again, you can look for the .gov information on ADA and service animals to get more information on that. There's definitely some very clear stipulations on what you can ask, which I covered, when you can ask for the removal of a service animal, and just more information and more guidance about service animals in your business. But business owners are protected. And that's something that I think, if we saw more businesses utilizing their rights to require the removal of out of control service animals, we would be seeing less issues with that in places of public accommodation.
There is so much gold in everything you just shared, because you touched on
Kind of a lot. I just kind of like lumped it all together.
it was really good though. So I will tell you, just from firsthand experience, the understanding of service animals extends far outside of just healing arts practitioners. For example, at Mimosa, at my crystal shop, we have people coming in with service animals all the time.
Absolutely.
So it's important to know and understand those rules. I will tell you, how long have I been at Mimosa? Since 2006. So however many years that is.
A while.
In all that time, we have never had an issue with a
great.
genuine service animal. With a genuine.
It can vary from locality to locality. It kind of sometimes can be a regional issue, but it can be an issue. And I think it's really important for business owners to understand what their legal rights are in terms of protecting their businesses, but also protecting their clients and their patrons from out of control service animals, but also protecting their disabled clients who are bringing in legitimately trained service animals into their businesses as well.
I'm also really glad that you clarified for people that your allergies are not a legitimate reason to ask a service animal to leave. That's important to know. It may be a very valid concern of yours.
Absolutely.
But not a legal grounds for asking that service animal to leave. Also, you talked about so many things. So I'm going to back up to the beginning. No, it's been
together.
So great. Your husband's recommendation of going around in a wheelie office chair, I think is actually pretty genius, because one thing you and I were talking about also before we started recording was that for disabled people using a mobility device like a wheelchair, your line of sight is different. Right. Your eye level is different. Yep. And so also just looking for any potential hazards that would be at eye level.
Definitely.
To a person using a wheelchair would be
definitely huge. Well, and also just your products. Yeah. Can I in my chair see your products on tables, on shelving. And again, not everything is going to be able to accommodate every person every time, but it is something to think about. Like, are things visible? Are they, can I at least go, hey, can I see that up there? Versus a product set fully back on the back edge of a shelf and being lower with a lower line of eye sight. I can't even see that product, therefore I won't be able to purchase it even if I want to. So it's something to consider, even from a business perspective of, can that person even see my products so that they might, ask for assistance getting it off of a shelf. They can't see it, they can't get interested in it.
That kind of leads me to something else I was thinking about as you were giving a few different examples during this section, which is, I think, so often in any retail space, healing arts space, whatever it is, people tend to design the space for aesthetics.
Yep.
What they think looks good, but it may not necessarily be practical, particularly for disabled patrons. So like you said, can that disabled person even see the product, let alone reach the product or access the product, but even to see the product? But it also made me think of things like when you were talking about website accessibility. Mm-hmm. Do you have some way of people using a screen reader to change text size? Is the font a good contrast with the background? Yep. So that it's readable? The things that we may design a particular way or style a particular way because of aesthetics are not always accessible, which also makes me think about your physical space. Like in a healing arts room, I can't tell you how many times I've gone somewhere, I've worked out of different spaces when I was doing sessions or teaching, where yes, the room was really beautiful, but was there a big, chunky, bulky rug that was a trip hazard in the middle of the floor?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that trip hazard is going to increase exponentially when someone's using a mobility device like a walker or crutches or a cane. It gets so much worse. And like when you were talking about designing the spaces for aesthetics, just for a brief example, my local metaphysical store is I love to patronize it, but it's a small space. And the way they have their shelving set up, there is absolutely no way that I can bring my wheelchair into that space or my scooter. It's literally not physically possible. And so if I'm having a bad day, I can't go to that space. But I have another crystal shop that's local to me that her spaces are much wider open. And I'm actually able to use my wheelchair or my mobility scooter to navigate her space and see just about all of the products as well, because the product shelves are a little bit lower and just kind of completely visible for the most part, because they're not really high up on the walls. And again, I fully recognize that practitioners and business owners have to work within the limitations of their space, but it's about starting to become aware of how your space is set up and how people might be trying to navigate a space using a mobility device, and just getting it on the radar of just thinking about that and just starting to become aware of is my space able to be navigated? And for my local metaphysical shop, unfortunately, it's no. I also recognize the space is very small and they're kind of trying to do the best they can to have as much of their inventory available and that kind of thing, but it's not accessible at all. And it is something that I think about when I go there on a good day when I'm able to walk and I'm not needing my mobility device.
At some point, though, that's also a conscious decision, right? That each business owner needs to make. So once you have that awareness, you kind of can't unsee where the issues are, and you have a decision to make. Am I going to choose to maybe scale back the inventory a little bit, open things up a little bit, make things more accessible, or not? Right. And so that's something people have to think about. I'll tell you, even when Mimosa was in 2 spaces ago, we were in a store that's probably about a third, maybe a quarter, probably a third of the size of the shop we're in now. That was something we were always trying to be mindful of. And it would get a little bit messy, a little bit cluttered.
It's hard. Sure.
And we go, wait a minute. We've
Absolutely.
somehow lost some of our floor space. We've somehow lost some of our aisle space. Oh, this
Definitely.
new display that got set on the floor actually makes this whole aisle inaccessible. So it's not just a one-time thing, also.
Absolutely. It's
It's
a continuing thing as your space grows and changes and even seasonally. Even
yeah,
seasonally. Your holiday decorations. The way you set up your holiday decorations might your fully accessible space now might be less accessible because of how you've set up your holiday decorations. So it's definitely something that has to kind of be on your radar kind of continually. Like you said, it's not just a one-time thing. It's a process as your business grows and changes, or even seasonally and changes seasonally. Just something to be aware of with accessibility, and ultimately that also comes down to safety and liability. Because if you're setting up things and a person comes in using crutches and they catch their crutch on a corner that's sticking out because it wasn't visible, and they fall and they get injured, that's on your business. That's a ding against your liability insurance for your business. And so some of it, you can, obviously, yes, we should all want to do this to be good people, to help everybody, but think about it from a financial situation. Do you want to have a charge against your liability insurance? Do you want to potentially get sued? Because guess what? Medical insurance companies can sue your business without the client's permission,
yeah,
even against the client's direct wishes. They say, no, 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 it was my fault. It doesn't matter. That insurance company wants compensation, and they're going to get it how they can get it. So, even outside of, yes, we should do this to be, good people and support our communities and support people. This is also this can impact you financially and legally as well if your space is not accessible, and someone is injured because of that inaccessibility. It can become a financial and legal problem for your business as well.
absolutely. So another thing to consider
Right. Just
when you're doing those
not trying to freak
evaluations.
anybody out, but it's something to consider. It's something to consider as a part of your business plan.
Absolutely. Another thing I was thinking about when you were talking about uh, making sure that your website is accessible. And that can be many, many different things. It can be many,
Yes.
many different things. But when I was just planning my trip to go to England and I was looking up, hotels or B&Bs or different things to do, one thing I noticed that I do not see for places in the US is there were accessibility statements front and center at just about every hotel, B&B, tourist attraction, anything
Mm-hmm.
like that, that explained and described exactly the accessibility obstacles that
Right.
particular site had. So it would say is a long driveway that is uneven with 4 steps up to the front door. There is an elevator available. Or the accessible restroom is around the corner in the back of the property on the main floor. Like it was spelled out very clearly
Mm-hmm.
so that disabled people would know, okay, here is what to expect if I choose to go to this place, if I choose to be a patron of this place, which I think is just good because it takes so much of the guesswork out of it and it takes
Yes.
that burden away from the
Right.
disabled person. Because, like you mentioned before, there's this, and this has been a common thread through many of our
Sure.
interviews, a reluctancy to maybe speak up all the time for what your needs are.
Absolutely.
And so
It's
just putting those
uncomfortable.
things,
It's
yeah,
uncomfortable to do it. It draws attention to you. And if it draws attention to the business, if they aren't able to accommodate you, and not all, I'm sorry to say, not all businesses are very compassionate about that. There, unfortunately, is still a lot of ableism about, well, you know what? Too bad. It's like, it's not my problem or not my fault, or it's the building, or, and so it can be a very uncomfortable situation to try to navigate that as well, for sure. Definitely.
and like you said earlier, you fully recognize the limitations that some businesses may have because of the building that they rent or whatever. And, there are things that are going to be outside of your control, but for the things
Right.
that are inside of your control,
Right.
go that extra mile to just make it really clear, like putting that statement on your website. such an easy thing
Yes.
we can all do, which I'm just taking mental note of my own words here. We have one on Mimosa's website, but I feel like that's so important and something that it's easy and anyone can do it.
Right. And it's there can be a lot of nuance, and there's regulations and rules and requirements for businesses in regards to accessibility, and not everyone knows everything every time, especially right away with a new business or a new building. So it can be a learning process, and I fully recognize that. But I think where a lot of times we get frustrated is when either business owners or building managers just kind of throw up their hands and go, too bad, or, well, I didn't know, or I can't do anything about that, rather than going, oh, okay, this is an issue. We should look at and address it. I mean, I just, for example, I just recently went to an event at a public aquarium here. And as I was leaving, I was in my mobility scooter and we approached the door to leave. And I'm looking around for the push button to open the doors, and there wasn't one for this huge city public aquarium. There's no accessibility button for the doors to open automatically for people who are using mobility devices. And the staff was kind of like, oh, yeah, we don't have one. And I said, well, you guys really should have one. And it's something that I personally need to follow up on, but therein lies the rub. Now I have to do the labor to follow up and email and basically write a complaint and say, hey, I noticed this issue. And unfortunately, more than likely, it's not going to get resolved. It may, but the reality is a lot of times those things don't get resolved. But they also can't fix it if they don't know that's a problem. But it
Yes.
still puts the onus of responsibility on the disabled person to go, oh, hey, this is an issue. Everybody knows about door buttons, or at least they should on these big public buildings. Come on now. There's no door button. Let's get with it here a little. It's so it's going to be a learning process for every business and every building, but it's being aware. It's starting, it's having it on your radar and going, wait a minute, I didn't think about that before. And just starting that process, that I think is just really important.
And I think as business owners or as practitioners in particular, what we should recognize is something that you just said that was really key here. If something is brought to your attention by a disabled person as being an accessibility issue, rather than saying, well, I can't do anything about that,
Right.
ask yourself, what can I do
Right.
about that? What is in my control? If I'm
Right.
really thinking creatively and thinking outside of the box, what is possible here? Um,
Right.
because chances are maybe it won't be 100% of the solution that
Right.
everyone would love, but if you can just get part way there, that's better than
Right.
nothing. And realizing the
Absolutely.
disabled person who's communicated that has done that labor to bring that your
Right.
attention, and acknowledging that and um, doing something with that. You know what I mean? Because
Yes.
they're not also just doing it for themselves, but for other people who encounter.
Right. Because if it affects me or it affects one person, it's going to affect more people. And ultimately, accessibility is good for everybody, because everybody can benefit from accessibility. And so working towards accessibility helps everybody and doesn't take anything away pretty much from anybody. And so it's a process, but like you said, try, try. May not be perfect. It may take time. It may take some thinking and some brainstorming to try and figure out, it may not be something where you can go, oh, okay, well, I'll just fix that while you're in the business. But it can be like, wow, thank you for telling me that. I wasn't aware that was an issue. I'm gonna try and come up with a solution to that. And honestly, hearing that, like if I heard a business tell me that, I'd be like, oh my gosh, like thank you so much for listening to me, for hearing me, rather than ignoring me and blowing me off.
Well, and
That's gonna and honestly, that would make me want to come back to that business. Whereas I've had not nice responses from businesses, and it makes me never want to patronize your business ever again.
yeah, And
even if the thing never gets fixed.
right. And
Simply
that's
saying,
the
I'm
thing.
trying, I'm thinking, I know this, yeah, you know what? Someone else brought that up. We're working on trying to find a solution. I'm going to go, oh, okay, great. You're thinking about it. Awesome. That's great. That's really meaningful, at least to me personally. It's like you're trying. And to me, trying really makes a really big difference for me wanting to continue to patronize your business.
And I think that's just true across the board. Like if you're approaching it as a reasonable person going, I don't have like 100% answer, but I'm trying to field
Right.
solutions. And some things are going to be a short-term solution and some
Right.
things will be a long-term solution. Like just
Exactly.
communicating that as well.
Exactly. Communication goes a long way. And I will freely admit I have had to go and run an errand on a bad day, and I may not have been as pleasant as maybe I could have been when I've, encountered my fourth inaccessible thing. And it's made me even more exhausted and frustrated because it's taking me even more energy to complete this task that already takes me more energy than, say, an able-bodied person. Um, there have been days when I've been short with work, business workers and things like that. And I think that is something to consider as well is, if we're saying something, it's because it is affecting us directly. And this is not to excuse rudeness or definitely not to excuse any kind of abuse whatsoever, but we may be having a really bad day and that thing just made our day even more difficult. And we may not always handle it, 100% in the most perfect way, but please don't ignore the fact that we said something maybe in a little bit of a brusque tone because of the tone. Listen to what we're saying and kind of take the underlying meaning. And again, I'm not excusing any kind of abuse of workers or anything like that, but you know maybe I'm a little gruff when I talk to the manager and say, hey, this keeps happening. It's making my life more difficult. Can you please do something about it? So again, and obviously people are going to have different feelings about that, but there's also kind of there's a bit of a form of ableism that, oh, disabled people are always supposed to be nice and congenial and pleasant and, happy. And it's like, no, we have our bad days too. So we may not handle everything 100% perfect every time. And again, not excusing abusive behavior, but if we're a little brusque, consider that it's probably because we're already having a difficult day and this thing made it that much more difficult for us. And that's why we're finally saying something.
And it's also really easy to just hold compassion and empathy for someone as a human.
Right.
Like, even if they are maybe it came across a bit rude, but like you said,
Right.
just having that awareness that there's probably a good reason for where that's
Right.
come from is really
Right.
helpful. So I appreciate you mentioning that. Uh,
Yeah. I felt a little weird, I'm just like, do I say it? Do I not say it? But there's some ableism involved, but then also just being a person, like you don't have to be disabled to have a bad day and have that one thing go wrong and finally go, darn it.
for sure. So let me ask you, in what ways do non-disabled crystal workers need to consider their own ableism and the biases that they may hold when it comes to their work with their clients or their colleagues who are disabled? Like, how have you seen ableism, in addition to the ways that we've already talked about, show up in this space?
So I think one of the most prevalent ways that I've seen ableism show up in like the wellness and healing spaces is the really, really toxic mentality that people dealing with disability or chronic illness are keeping themselves sick or that we're stuck in a sickness mindset. It's so harmful, it's so traumatizing, it's so victim blaming, and it's so dangerous. Um, I'm going to say it this way, and I'm sure there's some people that might do. Nobody wants to be sick all the time. Nobody wants to be sick all the time. Um, and so to say that people are keeping themselves sick or stuck in a sickness mindset is kind of one of the grossest forms of ableism that I've seen and really tells me that you don't get it. You don't get it at all. I've been dealing with disabling chronic illness for over 20 years. I would do just about anything to not deal with my symptoms every single day. It has affected every part of my life. It has taken careers away from me. It's taken life opportunities away from me. And obviously, I've made some of my own opportunities and I've continued to grow as a person while dealing with this, but my life would look very, very different if I weren't dealing with this. I would like to also add that there are definitely disabled people who it is a part of their identity and they don't want it to change. You're gonna find a lot of that in the deaf community. They don't see any reason, and it is 100% valid, that they're deaf, and there's nothing to change. There's nothing, to modify or get rid of it or anything like that. Um, from my personal experience and the personal experience of a lot of my friends, in other parts of the disability community, it's hard. We don't we don't want to be sick. And so to basically have other people in the healing and wellness communities say, well, you could just be better if you just stopped thinking about it so much, or if you thought a different way. It ties very much into toxic positivity, which you can research more about, things like that. It's hard, and honestly, it, this it can it can be so damaging. And I'm gonna put this out there. It can be life threatening.
Yeah.
It can absolutely be life threatening when you are at your wit's end dealing with your disabling chronic illness, and someone says, well, you're just keeping yourself sick, it's in your head. If you don't have the right support system, and I'm going to just be honest and say this, I heard this from medical practitioners early on in my journey. And had I not had my husband and a family and friends support system, I might not be here today. It's so damaging, and it's just wrong. It's just wrong. And I think is one of the most dangerous forms of ableism that I've seen in the healing and wellness communities, is this assumption that we're keeping ourselves sick or we're stuck in this illness mentality. Um, when something affects your life so completely, that's reality.
Yeah.
It's
And
not
you
keeping
know,
yourself stuck.
I'll tell you, like, this is 100% something I know every one of us, if we are being honest, has seen this. We've seen this in the wellness community. If you've been in this space for any
Yep.
period of time, you have seen this somewhere. You've read a book where this is a key theme.
Yep.
You've followed an Instagram influencer where this is a key theme. Because it's everywhere. And I will tell you from personal experience, this is something that definitely impacted me in my own life, when I was like in my early and mid 20s, dealing with reproductive health issues. Very much kind of got sucked into this like horrible way of thinking because it's what you hear. Also,
Yep.
being a person with a lived experience who has not experienced a disability, you don't even necessarily think when you're hearing this in your
Right.
little echo chamber of the wellness space, you're not like the whole application of that
Right.
mindset to disability is not necessarily even on your radar.
Yep.
But once you see that and you see how harmful it is, you can't
Yes.
unsee that.
You can't. You just can't. It is everywhere. I actually just unfollowed a person on YouTube that I was following. She did a whole video on, are you keeping yourself sick? And the example that she used, the person was completely not keeping themselves sick. And I was just like, and I started a dialogue with her in the comments, and it was just, everything stayed very constructive, but I'm just like, you do not understand how damaging this is. You don't understand how dangerous that mentality is. And I just, for myself personally, I'm like, I had to unfollow them because I'm like, I can't risk seeing more videos like that popping up in my feed. It's so traumatizing. Having gone through it myself in the medical community, in the wellness and healing community, it is so damaging that at this point it's so triggering for me that I can't, I have to unfollow those people because it's so difficult and so triggering for me. And I
Which is
think what
understandable, you know, like, and I think about what you said earlier about accessibility benefits everyone, increased access benefits
right,
everyone. Seeing our way out of this kind of toxic ableism benefits
and it's
everyone.
everybody. It really, really does. And I think I think it goes along with in terms of like practitioners, I think a lot a lot of it happens when people have not experienced chronic illness or disability, either with themselves personally or in people who are close to them. There's a lot of culturally and societally fostered ableism and internalized ableism as well. And so I see it even now in people dealing with current illnesses and things like that, where they're like, well, I gotta, I gotta get back to work. I gotta do this. It's like, no, you need to rest and recover. And again, I fully acknowledge that everybody's work situations are different, and most workplaces do not foster a community of, yeah, get yourself better and then come back to work. And everybody's financial needs are very, different and that type of thing. But it's it fosters and perpetuates ableism to see these things in the workplace as well and with businesses and that type of thing. And so it's it's a really difficult it's really difficult because we can do I think to go along with that form of ableism, especially in able-bodied people who haven't had experience, people tend to think, well, if I do all the right things, eat well, exercise, I'm going to be fine. I can't get disabled. But what people often don't realize is everybody can become disabled at any time. Every single person is one accident, one illness, one injury away from becoming disabled. Even if you're doing all the right things, you can be doing all the right things and get T-boned in a car accident, and now you're disabled because of an injury. Doesn't matter that you ate healthy and exercised and did all the right, right things. Now you're disabled. You can do all the things correctly and catch an illness, and that illness can have permanent, long lasting effects. You can step off a curb on an average day and break your ankle and have it shatter because it just was at just the wrong angle. And now you have a disability. It's not going to happen to every person every time, but it can. And so I think there's part of the ableism is there's this inherent belief that, well, if I just do all the right things, then I'm never going to be disabled. It won't affect me. But it can, and it can at any time. And that's not to be pessimistic or fatalistic or anything like that, but that is the reality. And far too many people don't realize that until it happens to them, even temporarily. And that's why I mentioned in asking the question, injury or disability, because you could break your leg and be temporarily disabled until that leg heals, and you're going to have a small experience of living with a disability temporarily. And sometimes that's what opens people's eyes. I'd rather have their eyes opened before that happens. I'd rather have them not have to go through something like that, either themselves or with, a friend or a family member or a partner, for us to all start considering ableism, accessibility, and disability. But because it's just not on able-bodied people's radars so often, unfortunately.
Well, and I think something that you said that really stands out to me is like the person who's sitting here watching right now thinking, but I do all the right things, right? Because there's almost this inherent
Yep.
othering that happens then,
Yep.
but that's not me. That's,
Yep.
that's someone else. That's not me. That's not my experience. So inherent to that ableism is this othering, which
Right.
we see you and I were talking about the importance of intersectionality as well
Yes.
in disability, and in how that shows up in ableism as well. People of
Yes.
color, trans folks, people with other marginalized identities that intersect with
Absolutely.
identity of disability are going to have, in many instances, not all instances, but in many
Sure.
instances,
Absolutely.
more trauma associated with their
Absolutely.
disability. So
Absolutely.
we also need to be really mindful of that because so much of ableism is also rooted in white supremacy culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's something that I didn't even kind of really touch on, which I should as a white person, I absolutely should acknowledge that there's so much tied together between white supremacy and ableism. Um, I do want to give a quick shout out to a disability influencer who addresses this quite frequently. She's amazing. Her name is Imani Barbary, and she is on Instagram and TikTok, I believe, just under her name or under Crutches and Spice. And she talks about the intersectionality of disability and all these other things so much as a disabled woman of color. And she just, if you want to follow somebody and get started on this journey of intersectionality and disability, she is a wonderful person to check out and subscribe to and learn from. She is just amazing because yes, so much of ableism is rooted in white supremacy and just otherism and bias, and it's actually kind of scary when you really start learning about it and delving into it. But I think it's so important for us to have our eyes opened to just how much disability intersects with so many other things, influences and is influenced by so many of these other things within our culture, within our society, and how important it is to realize that our individual experiences may be vastly different from somebody else's experiences, even with disability. And I mentioned that before when we were talking before. I'm a cis white woman. And so my experience of disability is going to be completely different from a person of color, from a non cis person, um, for a person with a different sexuality. And so that is going to really make a big difference in each individual's experience with disability and how it impacts their lives and affects the many different aspects of their lives as well. And so that's definitely something really important for us to consider, is that my experience with disability is going to be completely different from somebody else's experience with disability, not just because of the disability itself, but because of who we are and who we are assumed to be based on our appearance or how we're presenting or how we're living our lives. That way, it makes such a big difference. And even within, so people can have the same diagnosis and experience that same diagnosis so completely differently just within their different bodies, let alone their different identities and how they present and their choices and their gender and you know culture and whether they're a person of color and all of that type of thing. And so it and I meant to say gender identity, excuse me. I didn't mean gender, but gender identity. And so it's really important for people to understand that my experience of disability is going to be completely different from another person's experience of disability, not just because of my symptoms and my diagnosis, but because of who I am and who I'm seen as and who I present as, and how I live within our society. And all of those things can make such a huge difference and affect everything so much more.
That is so, so important. And it's important truly in learning about all aspects of life, but in particular,
Definitely.
because of the multiple marginalized identities or oppressed identities, I think that overlap often with disability.
Absolutely.
So important. So, kind of on that note, you and I were talking about the importance of not looking at one disabled person as a monolith who speaks for all disabled people because everyone's experience is different. Do you have any other resources, places where people can get more education about disability justice and accessibility or other issues that face disabled people, any places that they could look for information online? I know you already recommended Crutches and Spice, you recommended the DOJ website. Is there anywhere else that you turn to for more inclusive voices on disability justice?
Um, I have to be honest, not specifically. A lot of it was just Googling as issues came up for me personally or with my friends who are disabled or dealing with chronic illness. I would Google it and try to use, now, of course, I can't think of the word, but try to be discerning when it came to reading the materials and, look at who is writing them and what perspective they're writing them. And I think, honestly, as with many things, I think the most important thing is look for disabled contributors, people who are living this experience, not, and it's not that there's not value in things from like medical professionals and things like that, but the most value and the most valuable perspectives come from people whose it's their lived experience. And so I think that's really important to look at who's writing the articles, who's writing the books. Are they actually experiencing disability or are they writing about disability? And again, not that there's no value in those things from other perspectives and professionals and things like that, but they're not living it. They can't know. You can't. I'm sorry, you can't. Unless you're directly experiencing it, you can't really know. You can somewhat understand, but it's indirect. And so I think it's really important to look for sources who are disabled, who are actually experiencing living with disability and their perspectives. And there's such a wide variety. And again, there's so many different voices that I think it's just start exploring, look into it, see what comes up, and be aware. Try to be aware of your own personal biases and how those might be influencing your opinions and your thoughts on what you're reading. And ultimately listen to disabled people. Listen to us. If we say something is a problem, it's a problem. So listen to us. And I think those are kind of the most important things, in starting this journey. It's a journey, just like everything else. It's a journey. You're not going to know everything at once. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to say inappropriate things. You're going to ask inappropriate questions. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to set your space up wrong, and someone's going to, tell you that I can't, navigate to the space, things like that. Just listen, accept, and then try to do better. And I think that's all any of us can really do as we learn more, try to, grow more and try to do better. I think that's all we can ever do is just try to do better.
Very, very wise words indeed. Renee, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave others with regarding disability in the wellness community? For those who are watching this, who might be watching this in the future, what would you like to kind of leave everyone with?
I think the biggest thing is get it on your radar. Start becoming aware of it. And like I said, you're not going to be perfect, you're going to make mistakes, or you're not going to know things, and that's okay. But get it on your radar. If you are able-bodied, start considering it. It may not be something that you've considered before. And even if you're disabled, think about other perspectives and other people's experiences and how those might be different from your own experience, and start to consider those. And again, I'm not trying to be like pessimistic, but keep in mind, disability is a community you can enter at any time. Everybody is one illness, one accident, one injury away from becoming disabled, even if you do all the right things. And so it's something really important that, because of that, I think moving towards greater accessibility is so important because it helps everybody overall, and in general doesn't actively harm anyone. It makes things better for everybody. And so just get started, learn, ask questions, do the best that you can, learn more, grow more, try to do better, and be compassionate and listen. And I think those are the most important things when, working through this journey of trying to understand disability and accessibility.
Wow, Renee, thank you so much. I have to tell you, I've even learned a lot from our conversation today. I'm just so, so grateful for, again, not only you taking the time to do this interview today, but for you really getting the ball rolling with this conversation in our community group. Thank you. Thank you. You are so valued. I am so grateful for everything. And thanks just for being here and sharing a bit about your story, your experience, and your knowledge with us.
Thank you so much. And again, I want to thank you so much for giving me this opportunity and for being open to, having this perspective raised and awareness raised and continuing the discussion with this. It's really important and it matters. So thank you so much.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in and watching. We'll see you again in a future interview. Crystal blessings.